The rain fell in cold sheets over Chicago that night, turning the streets into rivers of neon reflections and diesel smoke. Sophie D'Amico gripped the steering wheel of her old Honda Civic as exhaustion pressed against her eyelids like weighted stones. 22 hours. That's how long she'd been at Mercy General Hospital, stitching wounds, holding hands of the dying, and fighting against the relentless tide of trauma that flooded the emergency room every single night. Her scrubs were stained with blood that wasn't hers, her hair tied back in a messy bun that had long since given up any pretense of order, and her mind buzzed with the kind of fatigue that made reality feel slightly distant, slightly unreal. She'd been a nurse for 3 years now, ever since graduating from Northwestern with loans that would take a decade to pay off, and a stubborn determination to make a difference in a city that chewed people up and spit them out without mercy. Her father, God rest his soul, had been a firefighter. He'd taught her that some people were born to run toward danger while everyone else ran away. "You got that same stupid courage in you, Piccola," he used to say, tapping her chest with one rough finger. "Just try not to get yourself killed with it." The streets were deserted at 3 a.m, the kind of empty that only came in the dead hours between last call and first light. Sophie's apartment was only 15 minutes away. 15 minutes until she could peel off these clothes, stand under scalding water, and try to wash away the memory of the teenager who died on her table tonight, despite everything she'd done. 15 minutes until she could pretend to sleep and fail at it like she did every night after losing someone. Then she heard it. The sound of metal screaming against metal, followed by the hollow boom of an explosion that rattled her car windows and sent a flock of pigeons erupting from a nearby rooftop in panicked flight. Sophie's foot hit the brake instinctively, her heart slamming against her ribs as she watched a fireball bloom against the darkness 3 blocks ahead. The orange glow painted the wet pavement in shades of hell, and thick black smoke rolled skyward like a funeral shroud. Every rational part of her brain screamed to call 911 and drive away. This was Chicago. This was the South Side. People died here every night for reasons that had nothing to do with her, and getting involved meant risking everything. But her father's voice echoed in her memory, and her hands were already turning the wheel toward the fire before her conscious mind caught up with her body's decision. The scene crystallized as she got closer. A black Mercedes sedan, expensive and sleek, had wrapped itself around a concrete light post with such force that the entire front end had crumpled like an accordion. Flames crawled across the hood and licked at the shattered windshield, fed by what could only be leaking gasoline. The driver's side door hung partially open, bent on twisted hinges, and through the smoke, Sophie could make out the silhouette of someone still inside, slumped against the steering wheel. She abandoned her car in the middle of the street, engine still running, and sprinted toward the wreck. The heat hit her like a physical wall when she got within 10 feet, singeing her eyebrows and making her skin prickle with the promise of burns. The smell of burning rubber and gasoline filled her lungs, acrid and toxic. But she pushed forward anyway, grabbing the hot metal of the door frame with her bare hands. "Hey, can you hear me?" Sophie shouted over the roar of the flames. No response. The man inside wasn't moving, his face obscured by blood and smoke. She could see glass embedded in his temple, a gash across his forehead that poured crimson down his cheek, and his expensive suit jacket torn and scorched. One of his hands still gripped the steering wheel with white-knuckled intensity, even in unconsciousness, as if he'd been trying to control the crash until the very last second. Sophie knew she had maybe 60 seconds before the fire reached the gas tank and turned this wreck into a crematorium. She yanked on the door with everything she had, her nursing scrubs offering zero protection against the heat, her sneakers slipping on the rain-slicked pavement. The door groaned but didn't give. She tried again, planting her feet and pulling with her legs, her back, every muscle screaming in protest. The metal shrieked and finally gave way, swinging open so suddenly she almost fell backward. The man was heavy, dead weight, and Sophie had to climb halfway into the burning car to get her arms under his. She registered details through the adrenaline. Expensive cologne mixed with blood, a gold Rolex on his wrist, a tattoo of what looked like a crow or raven stretching up his neck from beneath his collar, dark hair slicked back even in disaster, and a face that would have been striking if it weren't covered in blood and soot. He was young, maybe early 30s, and built like someone who spent serious time in the gym. "Come on, work with me here," Sophie grunted, hooking her hands under his armpits and hauling backward with everything she had. He slid out inch by torturous inch, his expensive Italian shoes scraping against the doorframe, his head lolling against her shoulder. She could feel his breath against her neck, shallow but steady, and relief flooded through her. Alive. He was alive. She'd dragged him maybe 20 feet from the car, her arms shaking with exertion and her lungs burning from smoke inhalation, when the Mercedes exploded with a sound like the end of the world. The shockwave threw Sophie forward over the man's body, her ears ringing, her vision whiting out for a terrifying second. When she could see again, the car was a twisted inferno, flames reaching 30 feet into the night sky, and pieces of burning metal were scattered across the intersection like shrapnel. Sophie lay there on the wet pavement, her heart hammering so hard she thought it might break through her ribs, the man's unconscious weight beneath her, and started to laugh. It was the kind of manic, disbelieving laughter that came when you'd just cheated death and couldn't quite believe you were still breathing. Her father would have killed her for being so reckless, then probably hugged her for being so brave, then killed her again for good measure. She rolled off the stranger and immediately went into nurse mode, checking his pulse at the wrist, then the neck. Strong and steady, maybe a little fast, but given the circumstances that was to be expected. She did a rapid assessment. Head trauma, definitely a concussion. Possible internal injuries from the impact. Multiple lacerations that would need stitches, but nothing that screamed immediate death. Lucky bastard. Lucky, stupid, reckless bastard who'd somehow walked away from a crash that should have turned him into paste. Sirens wailed in the distance, growing closer. Sophie sat back on her heels, her hands shaking now that the adrenaline was wearing off, and really looked at the man she'd just saved. Even unconscious and covered in blood, there was something about him that set off warning bells in her gut. The expensive suit that probably cost more than her monthly rent. The Rolex that could have paid off her student loans. The tattoo creeping up his neck, the way even in unconsciousness his jaw was clenched tight, like he was used to holding secrets even in sleep. This wasn't some random businessman who'd swerved to avoid a drunk driver. This was something else. Someone else. "Who the hell are you?" Sophie whispered to the unconscious man, as red and blue lights began to strobe across the scene, as firefighters poured out of their truck and paramedics rushed forward with a stretcher and equipment. She gave her statement to the cops in a daze, accepted the blanket someone wrapped around her shoulders, and watched as they loaded the stranger into an ambulance. "Ma'am, you should come to the hospital too," one of the paramedics told her, a kid who couldn't be older than 25. "You've got some burns, possible smoke inhalation. You need to be checked out." Sophie nodded absently, but she was still watching the ambulance pull away, its lights disappearing into the Chicago night, carrying the man whose name she didn't even know, the man she'd risked her life to save, the man who would change everything. She had no idea that she'd just pulled the most dangerous person in Chicago out of that fire. No idea that the crash had been no accident but an assassination attempt. No idea that by saving his life she'd marked herself for death. No idea that in 3 days he would appear at her door with eyes like winter storms and a debt he intended to pay in full, whether she wanted it or not. All Sophie knew as she climbed back into her Honda and drove home through streets that suddenly felt less safe than they had an hour ago was that something fundamental had shifted in the universe, that she'd stepped off the path her life was supposed to follow and onto something darker, more dangerous, more alive. She pulled into her apartment complex just as dawn began to gray the eastern sky, her hands still trembling on the wheel, the smell of smoke clinging to her hair and clothes, and wondered if the man had survived, wondered if she'd see him again. wondered if maybe, just maybe, she should have minded her own damn business and driven past that burning car. But Sophie D'Amico was her father's daughter, and people like them didn't drive past. They ran toward the flames, even when common sense screamed to run away, even when it might cost them everything, especially then. The next 72 hours passed in a blur of exhaustion and routine that Sophie tried desperately to lose herself in. She picked up extra shifts at Mercy General, volunteering for the trauma bay even though it meant more blood, more screaming, more death. Anything to keep her mind occupied, anything to stop thinking about the man in the burning car and the way his pulse had felt under her fingers, strong and steady, even as flames consumed everything around them. She didn't tell anyone what had happened. Not her best friend Maria, who worked in pediatrics and would have called her crazy for stopping in the first place. Not her mother, who still lit candles for her dead father every Sunday and would have had a heart attack at the thought of her daughter running into a burning wreck. The incident made the local news for exactly one cycle. Mysterious car crash on South Side, driver critical. No names, no details. Nothing to explain why an expensive Mercedes had wrapped itself around a light post at 3 a.m. in a neighborhood where cars like that stuck out like diamonds in dirt. Sophie checked the hospital records obsessively during her breaks, scrolling through admissions looking for any indication of where they'd taken him. But the major trauma centers in Chicago processed hundreds of patients a night, and without a name, she had nothing to search for. John Doe would have been processed, stabilized, and either moved to ICU or discharged depending on his condition, and she had no way of tracking which hospital he'd ended up in or what had happened after the ambulance pulled away. On the third night, her shift ran late because of a multi-car pileup on the expressway that flooded the ER with more patients than they could handle. Sophie didn't get out until nearly midnight, her feet aching in her nursing clogs, her scrubs splattered with someone else's blood again, and her mind fuzzy with the kind of exhaustion that made even simple thoughts feel like wading through mud. The parking garage was poorly lit and nearly empty at this hour, just a handful of cars belonging to night shift staff scattered across multiple levels. Sophie's Honda sat in its usual spot on level 3, and she was digging in her purse for her keys, her mind already on the hot shower and cold beer waiting at home, when she felt it. That prickling sensation on the back of her neck that every woman learns to recognize. The feeling of being watched. She looked up sharply, her keys clutched between her fingers like a makeshift weapon, the way her father had taught her years ago. The garage was silent except for the distant hum of ventilation and the tick of cooling engines. Nothing moved in the shadows. But Sophie's instincts, honed by 3 years of working in one of Chicago's most dangerous neighborhoods, screamed that she wasn't alone. Then she saw it. A black SUV with tinted windows parked 3 rows away, engine idling, exhaust curling into the cold air. It hadn't been there when she'd arrived for her shift 14 hours ago. She was certain of that. And it was positioned in such a way that it had a perfect view of her car. Sophie's heart kicked into overdrive. She walked faster, fumbling with her keys, her breath coming quick and shallow. Probably nothing. Probably someone waiting for a friend to get off shift. Probably her paranoid brain seeing threats where there were none because she'd been working too many hours and sleeping too little, and the incident with the burning car had left her more shaken than she wanted to admit. She'd just gotten her car door open when the SUV's doors opened and 2 men stepped out. They were big, dressed in dark suits that screamed money and muscle, and they moved with the kind of purposeful grace that made Sophie's nursing instincts scream danger. These weren't random thugs. These were professionals. "Sophie D'Amico?" the first one called out, his voice echoing off the concrete walls. He had a thick Chicago accent and a scar running through his left eyebrow that gave him a permanently skeptical expression. Every self-preservation instinct Sophie possessed told her to get in her car, lock the doors, and drive like hell, but she was also exhausted and angry, and so damn tired of being scared in a city that demanded courage just to survive. So instead of running, she straightened up and faced them, keys still clutched in her fist like claws. "Who's asking?" Her voice came out steadier than she felt, with just enough Italian-American sass to hide the terror making her hands shake. The second man smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Someone wants to speak with you. Won't take long. Just a conversation. And if I say no, then we'll wait here until you say yes." He spread his hands in a gesture that was probably meant to be reassuring, but came across as vaguely threatening. "Look, miss, we're not here to hurt you. Our employer just wants to thank you personally for what you did. You saved his life. He's grateful." Sophie's brain stuttered to a halt as understanding crashed through her. The man from the car, he was alive, and somehow he'd found out who she was, where she worked, and now he'd sent his people to collect her like she was a package to be delivered. "I don't want thanks," Sophie said, her voice harder now. "I don't want anything from him. I did what anyone would do. Tell your boss I'm glad he's okay and that we're even. No debt, no obligation, nothing." The first man shook his head slowly, almost sadly. "It don't work that way, miss. Not with Mr. Ricci. You saved his life. That creates a bond, whether you want it or not. He takes these things serious. Real serious. Ricci." The name clicked something in Sophie's memory, something she'd heard whispered in the break room at the hospital, in her neighborhood, in the restaurants her family frequented in Little Italy. Ricci, one of the old families. One of the names you didn't say too loud if you valued your health and wanted to avoid attention from people who solved problems with violence instead of words. Oh God. Oh God. She'd pulled a mobster out of a burning car. She'd saved the life of someone connected to organized crime, and now they thought she was owed something, or worse, that she knew something, or worse still, that she was involved somehow. "I don't know anything," Sophie said quickly, hating how her voice cracked on the last word. "I didn't see anything. I just helped because that's what I do. I'm a nurse. It's literally my job to help people. There's no story here. Nothing to worry about. We're good. Totally good." The second man's expression softened slightly, something almost like pity crossing his face. "Miss D'Amico, you don't understand. Mr. Ricci doesn't think you're a threat. He wants to thank you. That's all. Just a conversation, maybe dinner. A proper thank you from one human being to another. You can say no to dinner if you want. But the conversation?" He shook his head. "That's not optional. He's waiting." "Waiting where?" "Your apartment. He didn't want to ambush you at work. Thought it might cause problems with your job. Seemed more respectful to wait at your home. The thought of a stranger, a dangerous stranger, a mobster, waiting in her apartment made Sophie's skin crawl. But she also recognized the trap she was in. These men weren't asking. They were informing. And if she tried to run, they'd just follow. If she called the cops, she'd be marked as a snitch in a city where that label was a death sentence. If she refused, who knew what would happen? Sometimes the only way out was through. "Fine," Sophie said, forcing steel into her voice that she absolutely did not feel. "One conversation. Then he leaves and this is over. Deal?" "Deal," the first man agreed, but something in his eyes suggested he didn't really believe this would be over anytime soon. "We'll follow you home. Make sure you get there safe. Dangerous city at night, you know." The drive back to her apartment complex felt like it took hours instead of the usual 20 minutes. Sophie watched the black SUV in her rearview mirror the entire way, her mind racing through possibilities and scenarios, none of them good. She lived in a modest 2-bedroom in a neighborhood that was trying hard to gentrify, but hadn't quite made it yet. The kind of place where young professionals on tight budgets rubbed shoulders with families who'd been there for generations. Her apartment was on the 3rd floor of a building that had probably been beautiful in the 1920s, but now showed its age in cracked tiles and temperamental radiators. Sophie climbed the stairs slowly, the 2 suited men staying a respectful distance behind her, but close enough to prevent any thoughts of running. Her hand shook as she unlocked her door, wondering what she'd find on the other side. The man from the burning car sat on her couch like he owned it, like he owned the whole building, like he owned the entire city and was just graciously allowing everyone else to exist in it with him. He looked nothing like the broken, bloody stranger she'd dragged from the flames. His dark hair was freshly cut and styled in that slicked-back way that Italian men somehow made look effortless instead of trying too hard. He wore a charcoal gray suit that probably cost more than her car, tailored so perfectly it might as well have been painted on his athletic frame. The collar of his black shirt was unbuttoned, just enough to reveal the edge of that tattoo she'd glimpsed before. Intricate black ink that crawled up his neck like smoke, or shadows, or secrets. A gold Rolex caught the lamplight on his wrist, and a thick gold chain rested against his collarbone, subtle but unmistakable markers of wealth and power. But it was his face that stopped Sophie cold. Strong jaw, sharp cheekbones, full lips that looked like they smiled rarely, and meant it even less. His eyes were the color of winter storms, gray-blue and cold, with an intensity that made her feel like he could see straight through her skin to count her bones. A faint scar ran through his left eyebrow, and another traced his jawline. Badges of violence survived. He was beautiful in the way that dangerous things are beautiful. Compelling and terrible, and impossible to look away from. And those eyes were fixed on her with an expression she couldn't quite read. Gratitude, maybe, but also something else. Something darker and more complicated. Assessment. Calculation. Interest. "Sophie D'Amico," he said, his voice a low rumble with just a hint of Italian accent smoothing the edges of his words. "The nurse who runs into burning cars to save strangers. The woman who's either the bravest person I've ever met, or the most foolish." He stood up smoothly, all controlled power and coiled energy, and extended his hand. "Matteo Ricci, I believe you saved my life 3 nights ago. Please, sit. We need to talk." Sophie didn't move from where she stood by the door, her keys still clutched in her hand, her heart hammering against her ribs like it wanted to escape her chest and run away since her legs weren't cooperating. "You broke into my apartment." "The door was unlocked," Matteo said mildly, which was a lie since Sophie was obsessive about locking her door, but arguing seemed pointless. "I didn't want to wait in the hallway. Neighbors talk. Seemed more discreet this way. You sent your men to my workplace. You found out where I live. You invaded my home without permission." Sophie heard her voice rising and couldn't stop it, all the fear and exhaustion and stress of the past few days finally boiling over. "I saved your life. I asked for nothing. I expected nothing. And this is how you thank me? By stalking me? By terrifying me? By making me feel unsafe in my own apartment?" Something flickered across Matteo's face, so fast she almost missed it. Regret, maybe, or shame. But it was gone in an instant, replaced by that cold, controlled mask. "You're right," he said quietly, and the admission shocked her more than anything else could have. "You're absolutely right. This was handled badly. I apologize. Truly." He gestured to the door. "If you want me to leave, I'll leave. My men will leave. You'll never see or hear from any of us again. But before I go, I need you to understand something." "Understand what?" Matteo's jaw tightened, and for the first time Sophie saw something almost human flicker behind those cold eyes. Fear. "The men who tried to kill me 3 nights ago, they saw you pull me from that car, which means they know you're connected to me, which means you're in danger. Real danger, the kind that doesn't go away because you want it to." The words hit Sophie like a physical blow, stealing the air from her lungs. "What?" "The crash wasn't an accident," Matteo continued, his voice flat and emotionless, like he was discussing the weather instead of murder. "Someone tampered with my brakes and steering, meant for me to die in that wreck. They didn't account for a brave, stubborn nurse being in the wrong place at the wrong time. Now you're a witness, a problem, a loose end that needs to be tied up. Sophie's legs finally gave out, and she sank into the chair by the door, her mind reeling. You're saying people want to kill me because I saved you? Yes. That's insane. That's my world. Matteo moved closer, crouching down so they were at eye level, his gaze intense and sincere in a way that made her chest hurt. I know you didn't ask for this. I know you want nothing to do with me or the life I lead. But facts don't care what we want. Right now, this moment, you're in danger. And I can protect you. I will protect you. It's the least I can do after what you did for me. Sophie wanted to laugh, or scream, or maybe both. 3 days ago, her biggest problem had been student loan payments and deciding whether to adopt the stray cat that kept showing up on her fire escape. Now she was sitting in her apartment with a mobster, who was telling her that saving his life had marked her for death. What if I go to the police? She asked, knowing even as the words left her mouth how stupid they sounded. Matteo's expression didn't change. Then you'll be dead within 24 hours. The men who want me dead have cops on their payroll. Hell, they probably have federal agents on their payroll. You go to the authorities. You're just announcing exactly where to find you and that you're willing to talk. He paused. I'm not saying this to scare you more than you already are. I'm stating facts. This is how it works. So what? I'm just supposed to trust you? Trust that you'll keep me safe? Trust a man I don't even know? Sophie heard the hysteria creeping into her voice and couldn't stop it. For all I know, you're the dangerous one. Maybe this is all some elaborate plan to what? Kill me? Recruit me? Use me as leverage against someone? All valid concerns, Matteo agreed, straightening up. But consider this. If I wanted you dead, you'd be dead. If I wanted to use you, I wouldn't be here explaining the situation. I'd have just taken you. And as for recruiting? A ghost of a smile crossed his face, cold and sharp. You're a nurse, Sophie. You save lives. That's not useful in my business. Then what do you want from me? Matteo was quiet for a long moment, studying her with those winter storm eyes, and Sophie had the unsettling feeling he was seeing things about her that she didn't even know herself. Finally, he spoke, his voice softer than before, almost gentle. I want to keep you alive. I want to repay the debt I owe you. And maybe. He hesitated, and for just a second the mask cracked enough for her to see the man underneath. Tired, lonely, human. Maybe I want to be around someone who risks her life to save strangers because she thinks it's the right thing to do. That's rare in my world. Precious, even. Sophie didn't know what to say to that. Didn't know how to process any of this. So she just sat there, numb and overwhelmed, while Matteo Ricci waited for her answer to a question she didn't fully understand. Finally, she asked the only thing that mattered. If I say yes to your protection, what happens to my life? My job? My family and friends? You'll be safe, Matteo said simply. Everything else, we figure out together. It wasn't enough. It wasn't nearly enough. But sitting there in her ransacked sense of security, with the ghost of smoke still in her hair and the memory of flames reflected in a dying man's eyes, Sophie realized she didn't have much choice. She'd saved his life. Now he was offering to save hers. Whether she wanted it or not, they were bound together by blood and fire and debt. 1 week, Sophie heard herself say. You have 1 week to figure this out. Then I want my life back. Matteo nodded slowly, but something in his expression said he knew what Sophie was only beginning to suspect. That some things, once started, could never truly be undone. That some debts ran deeper than time or intention. That she'd stepped into his world 3 nights ago when she'd run toward those flames. And there might be no way back. 1 week, he agreed, knowing it was a lie they both needed to believe. Then you're free. But freedom, Sophie would learn, was a luxury neither of them could afford anymore. Sophie had exactly 20 minutes to pack a bag before Mateo's men arrived to escort her out of Chicago. 20 minutes to decide what mattered when you were leaving your life behind, even temporarily. She grabbed clothes without thinking, throwing jeans and sweaters and underwear into her old gym bag alongside her phone charger, medications, and her father's firefighter badge that she kept in her nightstand drawer for luck. 20 minutes to say goodbye to the apartment where she'd built a life over the past 3 years, not knowing if she'd ever see it again. Maria called as Sophie was locking the door one last time, her best friend's face filling the phone screen with concern. "Hey, I'm covering your shifts for the next week like you asked, but you need to tell me what's going on. Are you sick? Is it your mom?" "Sophie, you're scaring me." Sophie forced a smile that felt like broken glass. "Family emergency, but nothing serious. I just need some time away. I'll explain when I get back, I promise." "You're a terrible liar. You know that, right?" "I know. I love you. Tell everyone I'm fine. I'll be back soon." She ended the call before Maria could argue, before the tears threatening to spill could betray how not fine everything actually was. The two suited men from the parking garage waited by a different black SUV, their expressions professionally neutral, like they transported kidnapped nurses to secret locations every day, and it was just another Tuesday. The drive took 3 hours, heading northwest out of the city through suburbs that gradually gave way to farmland and forest. Sophie dozed fitfully in the back seat, exhaustion finally catching up with her now that the initial shock had worn off. When she woke, they were pulling up a long gravel driveway toward a house that looked like something from a magazine about how the other half lived. It wasn't ostentatious, which somehow made it more intimidating. A modern 2-story structure of stone and glass and dark wood, positioned on a bluff overlooking a lake that stretched silver and vast under the afternoon sun. Mountains rose in the distance, their peaks still dusted with early winter snow. The property was surrounded by trees, isolated and private, with no neighbors visible in any direction. Beautiful and lonely in equal measure. Mateo stood on the front steps waiting for them, changed from his suit into dark jeans and a black Henley that clung to broad shoulders and made him look more human and somehow more dangerous at the same time. The tattoos on his neck seemed darker in the natural light, more detailed. Sophie could make out what looked like a raven or crow in flight, wings spread, done in intricate black and gray ink that probably took dozens of hours to complete. "Welcome," he said as she climbed out of the SUV, his voice carefully neutral. "I know this isn't what you wanted. I'm sorry for that. But you'll be safe here. I give you my word." "The word of a mobster," Sophie said, hearing the bitterness in her own voice but unable to stop it. "That's supposed to make me feel better?" Something painful flickered across Mateo's face. "The word of a man who owes you his life. That should mean something." He gave her a tour of the house in silence, heavy with tension and unspoken things. The main floor was all open concept, a kitchen that looked like it had never been used flowing into a living room dominated by floor-to-ceiling windows that framed the lake view like living art. Exposed wooden beams crossed the high ceilings, and a stone fireplace large enough to stand and anchored one wall. Upstairs, 4 bedrooms, each with its own bathroom. He showed her to the largest guest room, done in calming blues and grays, with a bed that looked like you could get lost in it, and another spectacular view of the water. "This is yours for as long as you need it," Mateo said, setting her bag on the bed. "There's a landline phone in the kitchen, but no cell service out here. Too remote. We have satellite internet if you need to check email or whatever. Food in the fridge and pantry. Books in the library downstairs. Make yourself comfortable." "A gilded cage is still a cage," Sophie pointed out, wrapping her arms around herself against a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. "I know." Mateo moved toward the door, then paused, his hand on the frame. For what it's worth, I understand why you hate this. Hate me. I would too, in your position. But I meant what I said. You're safe here. And the moment it's safe for you to go back to your life, I'll personally drive you home myself. That's a promise. He left before she could respond, his footsteps quiet on the hardwood floors, leaving Sophie alone in a room that smelled of cedar and lake water, and a luxury she'd never been able to afford. She sat on the edge of that enormous bed and let herself cry for the first time since the night of the fire, all the fear and anger and disbelief finally pouring out in hot, silent tears that soaked into her hands. The first 3 days passed in a strange kind of suspension. Sophie saw Matteo only at meals, which they ate in uncomfortable silence at the large kitchen table, neither quite knowing what to say to the other. He was unfailingly polite, asking if she needed anything, if the room was comfortable, if there was food she preferred. She answered in monosyllables, still angry, still scared, still not sure if she was a guest or a prisoner or something in between. She noticed things about him in those careful silences. The way he held himself with military precision, even when he thought no one was watching, like he expected attack from any direction at any moment. The scars on his hands and forearms, some old and silvered, others newer and still pink. How he never fully relaxed, even sitting down, always positioned with his back to the wall and a clear view of all entrances and exits. The shadows under his eyes that suggested he slept as badly as she did, if he slept at all. On the 4th morning, Sophie came downstairs at dawn, unable to sleep, and found Matteo standing at the floor-to-ceiling windows watching the sun rise over the lake. He didn't turn when she entered, but his shoulders tensed slightly, acknowledging her presence. "Couldn't sleep either?" Sophie asked, moving to stand a respectful distance away. Both of them reflected ghost-like in the glass. "I don't sleep much," Matteo admitted. "Old habit. You can't survive in my world if you let your guard down, even in your dreams." "That sounds exhausting." "It is." He finally turned to look at her, and in the pale early light he looked younger than she'd thought, maybe only 32 or 33, and impossibly tired. "Coffee?" They sat at the kitchen island drinking espresso from a machine that probably cost more than Sophie's monthly rent, steam rising between them like the words they weren't saying. Finally, Matteo spoke, his voice quiet but clear. "You must have questions. About me, about what happened, about why someone would want me dead enough to tamper with my car. I'll answer anything you want to know. You've earned that much honesty." Sophie considered this, warming her hands on the cup. "Are you actually in the Mafia, or is that just what people assume based on your last name and your Italian heritage and the expensive suits?" "I am." No hesitation, no euphemism, just flat honesty that made her breath catch. 4th generation Ricci. My great-grandfather came over from Sicily in the 30s and built an empire through hard work, smart investments, and when necessary, violence. My grandfather expanded it. My father maintained it. And I inherited it when he was killed 6 years ago. Inherited it. Like it's a business. A legacy. It is both those things. Also, a burden. A prison. A death sentence that just hasn't been carried out yet. Matteo's jaw tightened. "I'm not looking for sympathy. I made my choices. I knew what I was getting into, but you asked for honesty, so there it is. I'm the head of the Ricci crime family. I run operations across Chicago and 6 surrounding states. Extortion, gambling, loan sharking. Some drug distribution, though I try to limit that, and legitimate businesses used for laundering money. I've ordered people hurt. I've ordered people killed. I'm not a good man, Sophie. I stopped being good a long time ago if I ever was." The confession should have terrified her. Should have sent her running from the room, from this house, from this man who just admitted to being everything her father had spent his life fighting against. But instead, Sophie found herself studying Matteo's face, seeing not a monster but a man trapped in a life he wore like chains. "Why did someone try to kill you?" she asked instead of running. "Vittorio Mancini, my consigliere, my right hand for 8 years. Matteo's voice went flat, emotionless, which somehow made it worse. "Turns out he's been planning a coup for months, lining up support, making alliances with the families that resent my policies, skimming money to fund his takeover. The car crash was supposed to look like an accident. Quick, clean, no blowback. Put me in the ground and take control while everyone was still reeling from my death. But you didn't die." "No. Because a stubborn nurse happened to be driving past at 3 a.m. and decided one life was worth risking hers for." Matteo's eyes found hers, and the intensity there made her chest ache. "Do you know how rare that is? In my world, people don't help strangers. They don't risk anything without calculating what they'll get in return. But you ran toward a burning car without hesitation, without thinking about reward or recognition or anything except that someone needed help. You reminded me that people like you exist, that not everyone is broken the way I am." Sophie didn't know what to say to that, didn't know how to process the weight of admiration and longing in his voice when he talked about her choice that night. "What happens now? With Vittorio?" "I find him. I end him. I send a message that betrayal in the Ricci family comes with a price." Matteo's voice went cold again, the momentary vulnerability shuddering closed. "That's how it works. That's the only language my world understands. And after you kill him, then what? Someone else will eventually try. Someone else will think they can take you down. The cycle just continues. Yes. Simple. Bleak. Inevitable. Until someone finally succeeds. That's the deal we make. That's the price of power." They sat in silence for a while, the sun climbing higher, painting the late gold in rose and burning away the morning mist. Sophie thought about her father, about the codes he'd lived by, the clear lines between right and wrong that had governed his life. She thought about the oath she'd taken as a nurse to do no harm, to preserve life above all else. And she thought about the man sitting across from her, admitting to terrible things, but also protecting her at great cost to himself when he could have just let her die. "I don't agree with your world," Sophie said finally. "I don't condone what you do or how you do it, but I'm starting to understand that you're more complicated than the stories make you out to be, more human." "Don't mistake humanity for goodness," Matteo warned, but something in his expression had softened. "I'm still a killer, Sophie. That doesn't change just because I have a conscience that keeps me up at night." "No, but it means maybe you're not beyond saving. If you wanted to be saved." Matteo laughed, but it was a broken sound, empty of real humor. "I was born into this, bred for it, trained from childhood to take over the family business. You can't save someone from their own blood, from their own nature. My father used to say that redemption isn't about where you come from. It's about what you choose to do when you finally see a different path." Sophie met his eyes and held them, willing him to hear her. "You saved me by bringing me here. Let me try to return the favor." "How?" "By being someone who sees you as a person instead of a title. By not giving up on you even when you've given up on yourself." She smiled slightly. "Besides, I'm trapped here for at least a few more days. Might as well put my stubborn nature to good use." Something shifted in Matteo's expression, like ice beginning to crack under unexpected warmth. "You're either brave or crazy, Sophie D'Amico. I still can't figure out which." "Maybe both. Maybe that's what it takes." After that morning, the dynamic between them changed. Matteo started actually talking during meals, telling her about growing up in Chicago, about his parents, about the day he realized his father's import business was actually a front for organized crime. Sophie shared stories about nursing school, about losing her father to cancer 2 years ago, about choosing to work in the ER because she couldn't stand the idea of people suffering alone. He taught her to play poker in the evenings, discovering she had a talent for reading tells and bluffing that made him laugh when she cleaned him out 3 hands in a row. She cooked dinner most nights, Italian dishes her grandmother had taught her, filling the house with smells of garlic and basil and tomato sauce that made Matteo look almost peaceful. On the 6th day, Sophie noticed Matteo favoring his left side and moving stiffly when he thought she wasn't watching. "You're still hurt from the crash," she said, watching him wince as he reached for a coffee cup. "Let me take a look." "It's nothing. Couple bruised ribs. They'll heal." "Matteo." She used her nurse voice, the one that made even the toughest gang members in the ER shut up and follow orders. "You can either let me examine you voluntarily, or I can wait until you're asleep and do it anyway. Your choice." He stared at her for a long moment, then slowly pulled off his shirt with an expression somewhere between exasperation and amusement. "You're terrifying when you go all medical on me. You know that?" Sophie's retort died on her lips as she saw his torso. The bruising from the crash was spectacular, purple and green and yellow spreading across his ribs and back like violent art. But it was the scars underneath that made her breath catch. Dozens of them. Bullet wounds and knife wounds and burns. A roadmap of violence survived written on his skin. The tattoo she'd glimpsed on his neck continued down across his shoulder blade, the raven's wings spreading across his back in intricate detail, with words in Italian she couldn't quite read woven through the design. "This one was from my first real job," Matteo said quietly, touching a puckered scar above his hip. "I was 17. A collection that went wrong. Guy pulled a knife. I was lucky he was drunk, or it would have been worse. And this," he indicated a perfectly round scar on his shoulder, "was from a rival family. Message sending. I was 21, still learning the rules. Still thinking I could reason with people who only understood force." Sophie's fingers traced the edges of the worst bruising, gentle and professional, checking for signs of internal bleeding or organ damage. But her eyes kept returning to those scars, to the story they told of a life lived in violence since childhood. "When did you get your first scar?" she asked softly. "I was 12. Training accident, my father called it. He wanted to make sure I could take pain without crying out, without begging. Said a boss who shows weakness doesn't last long." Matteo's voice was matter-of-fact, like he was describing the weather. "He broke my arm in 3 places. Told me to walk it off. To be a man." Sophie's hands stilled. She thought about being 12, about still believing in heroes and happy endings, about her father teaching her to ride a bike and taking her for ice cream and tucking her in at night with stories about brave firefighters. And she looked at this man who'd been taught that love meant violence, that strength meant shutting down every soft emotion, that survival required becoming a monster. "I'm sorry," she whispered. And she wasn't just talking about the broken arm from 2 decades ago. She was apologizing for every moment of his childhood that had been stolen, for every scar that represented love twisted into cruelty, for the boy who'd never had the chance to be soft or safe, or simply a kid. Matteo's jaw tightened. Don't pity me. I don't deserve it. It's not pity. It's grief. For the child you were. For everything you should have been protected from." Sophie forced herself to meet his eyes. "None of this is your fault, Matteo. Not the life you were born into. Not the choices you made when those were the only options you were taught existed. You deserved better. You deserved a father who protected you instead of breaking you. And I'm sorry you never got that." For a long moment, Matteo just stared at her, and Sophie watched something break open in his expression, some wall he'd been maintaining his entire life finally crumbling under the weight of someone seeing his pain and acknowledging it instead of dismissing it. His eyes went bright with tears he refused to let fall, his hands clenching and unclenching like he didn't know what to do with the emotion threatening to overwhelm him. "No one's ever said that to me before," he said roughly, his voice thick. No one's ever looked at me and seen anything except the monster, the boss, the killer. But you look at me and see the kid who got broken. How do you do that? Because I spent 3 years in the ER patching up gang members and mobsters and people everyone else had written off as irredeemable. And I learned that everyone has a story. Everyone has a reason they became who they are. That doesn't excuse the harm they've caused, but it does mean they're still human, still worthy of compassion, still capable of choosing a different path forward. Sophie touched his face gently, her thumb tracing the scar on his jaw. You're not beyond saving, Matteo Ricci. You're just someone who's never been shown what saved looks like. He turned his face into her palm, his eyes closing, and Sophie felt the moment crystallize into something profound and irreversible. This man, this killer, this crime lord who'd been breaking people since he was barely more than a child himself, was trusting her with something infinitely more dangerous than his physical safety. He was trusting her with the truth of who he'd been, before the world taught him to be cruel. The boy underneath the boss, the human beneath the monster. And God help her, Sophie wanted to save him. Wanted to believe that redemption was possible even for someone who'd done terrible things. Wanted to prove that one person choosing to see you differently could change everything. When Matteo finally opened his eyes again, the vulnerability was shuttered away, replaced by that controlled mask he wore so well. But something had shifted between them. Some fundamental understanding had been reached that couldn't be taken back. They both knew it. Both felt it. Both were terrified of what it meant. Your ribs aren't broken, Sophie said, stepping back to re-establish professional distance, even though it felt like tearing herself away from warmth and safety. Just badly bruised. They'll heal in another week or 2. Keep taking the anti-inflammatories. Try not to get into any fistfights. I'll do my best. Matteo pulled his shirt back on, wincing slightly. Thank you, for checking, for caring, for everything. That's what I do. I care about people even when they tell me not to. Especially then. That night, Sophie stood at the windows of her room watching moonlight paint silver paths across the lake, and admitted to herself what she'd been trying to deny since that first morning over coffee. She was falling for him, for the broken man inside the killer, for the vulnerability he tried so hard to hide, for the glimpses of who he might have been if the world had been kinder. It was dangerous, foolish, probably the worst decision she could make. But Sophie had always run toward the flames when everyone else ran away. And Matteo Ricci was the most compelling fire she'd ever known. One she might burn alive trying to rescue. One that might just save her in return. Outside her door, Matteo stood in the hallway with his hand raised to knock, the words he needed to say trapped in his throat. Words about how she made him want to be different. Better. How for the first time in his life, he thought maybe redemption wasn't just a fantasy, but an actual possibility. How she terrified him more than any enemy ever could, because she had the power to break him in ways no violence ever would. But he didn't knock, didn't disturb her. Just stood there for a long moment before walking away, telling himself it was better this way, that getting closer would only put her in more danger, that the kindest thing he could do was keep his distance and let her go the moment it was safe. He was lying to himself. They both knew it. The question was what they'd do when lying became impossible, when the truth of what they felt demanded to be acknowledged and acted upon, when saving each other became the only thing that mattered. Consequences be damned. The answer would come soon enough, sooner than either of them was ready for. Because in Chicago, Vittorio Mancini had discovered exactly where Matteo was hiding, and he was coming to finish what he'd started, with a plan that would force Sophie and Matteo to choose between safety and each other, between survival and love, between the lives they'd been living and the life they might build together, if they were brave enough to fight for it. The peace couldn't last. Sophie knew it, somewhere deep in the part of her brain that had learned to sense trouble before it arrived. the same instinct that had kept her alive 3 years working in Chicago's most dangerous ER. She just didn't expect it to end the way it did, with morning coffee and the sound of gravel crunching under tires that shouldn't be there. Mateo heard it first. His head snapped up from the newspaper he'd been reading, every muscle in his body going taut with tension. "Stay here," he ordered, already moving toward the window, his hand instinctively reaching for the gun Sophie had pretended not to notice he kept holstered at his back. But Sophie had spent too many shifts in trauma bays not to recognize the prelude to violence. She followed him to the window, peering through the curtains to see 3 black SUVs rolling up the gravel driveway, moving slowly, deliberately, like predators who knew their prey was trapped. "Vittorio," Mateo said, the name coming out like a curse. His jaw clenched so hard Sophie could see the muscle jumping. "He found us." "How?" "You said this place was secret, that no one knew about it except your most trusted people." "Apparently, my most trusted people aren't as trustworthy as I thought." Mateo was already moving, grabbing Sophie's arm and pulling her away from the window. "We need to go. Now, there's a car in the garage with keys in the ignition. Take it and drive south. Don't stop until you hit the next town. Find a police station and—" "I'm not leaving you here alone to fight off however many men are in those cars," Sophie interrupted, pulling her arm from his grasp. "That's insane. If we're going, we go together. Sophie, listen to me." Mateo grabbed her shoulders, his gray-blue eyes intense and desperate in a way she'd never seen before. "These men are here to kill me. They won't hesitate. They won't negotiate. And if they find out you mean something to me, they'll use you to hurt me in ways I can't even describe. The best thing, the only thing you can do to help me right now is run. Please." The sound of car doors slamming echoed through the house, followed by footsteps on the front porch. Male voices calling out in Italian, some laughing, all of them confident in the violence they'd come to commit. Time had run out for arguments or plans or anything except survival. Sophie made a choice. She ran, but not to the garage. Instead, she grabbed her phone from the kitchen counter and ducked into the pantry, pulling the door mostly closed, leaving just enough of a gap to see through. If Mateo thought she was going to abandon him to face his would-be killers alone, he didn't know her at all. She'd pulled him from a burning car once. She'd do it again if she had to. Fire or bullets be damned. The front door exploded inward with a crash of splintering wood. 6 men poured into the house, all armed, all moving with the practiced efficiency of professionals who'd done this before. And leading them was a man who could only be Vittorio Mancini. Late 40s, silver threading through dark hair, wearing an expensive suit that matched Mateo's style, but somehow looked predatory instead of elegant. His face was handsome in a sharp, cruel way, like a knife designed to look like jewelry. "Mateo!" Vittorio called out cheerfully, like they were old friends meeting for drinks instead of enemies in a house that would probably see bloodshed in the next few minutes. Come out. Let's talk like civilized men. No need for anyone to get hurt unnecessarily." Mateo emerged from the kitchen, gun drawn but pointed at the floor, his expression carefully blank. "Vittorio, can't say I'm happy to see you, but I appreciate you saving me the trouble of hunting you down." Always the confident boss, even when you're outgunned 6-1 in a house you thought was secret. Vittorio's smile was all teeth, no warmth. "Did you really think I didn't know about this place? I've known about it for 3 years, Mateo. Been waiting for the right moment to use that information. Thank you for finally giving me the opportunity." From her hiding spot, Sophie watched Mateo's finger tighten on his gun, saw the calculation in his eyes as he assessed angles and distances and chances of survival. The math wasn't good. She'd seen enough gunshot wounds to know that even if Mateo was the best shot in the world, 6 against 1 meant he'd be riddled with bullets before he could take down more than maybe 2 of them. "You want the family?" Mateo asked, his voice steady despite the odds. "You want to be the boss? Fine, take it. I'm tired anyway." 33 years old and already exhausted with the whole thing. You can have Chicago. You can have everything. Just walk away. Let this be the end of it. Vittorio laughed, and the sound made Sophie's skin crawl. You think I came all the way out here just to accept your resignation? That's not how this works. You don't get to retire, Matteo. You don't get to walk away. You die, and everyone knows I killed you, and I take over with the blood price paid. That's the only way the families will accept me. That's the only way I secure my position. You know this. You were raised in this life. Don't pretend you don't understand the rules. Yeah, I understand the rules. I also understand that the moment you pull that trigger, you start a war. My people are loyal. They'll come for you. And even if you kill them all, which you won't, the other families will see weakness. They'll see a man who had to resort to murder and betrayal to take power, and they'll circle like sharks. You'll be dead within 6 months. Is that really worth it? Your people are loyal to power, not to you personally. Once you're gone, they'll fall in line. As for the other families? Vittorio shrugged. I've been making deals for months. Alliances, promises. By the time your body is cold, I'll have enough support that no one will dare come at me. I've thought of everything, Matteo. Unlike you, I don't let sentiment make me stupid. Matteo's expression didn't change, but Sophie saw his shoulders shift slightly, saw him plant his feet in a way that screamed he was about to do something desperate. She knew what was coming before he moved, knew he was about to try to take out as many of them as possible before they killed him. Knew it was essentially suicide, but that he was going to do it anyway because that's who he was. And she couldn't let him die, not after everything. Not when she'd just started to believe he could be saved. Sophie burst from the pantry with her phone held high, the video recording light blinking red and obvious. Stop! All of you, stop! I've been recording everything. Every word you just said, Vittorio. Your confession. Your plan. All of it. And if anything happens to Matteo, if you kill him, this video goes straight to every news outlet in Chicago. Every federal agency. Everyone. You'll be finished. The room froze, everyone turning to stare at her in shock. Matteo's face went white, then red with fury. Sophie, what the hell are you doing? I told you to run. Yeah, well, I'm really bad at following orders. Sophie's hands were shaking so hard she could barely keep the phone steady, but her voice came out clear and strong. Especially when they involve letting someone I care about get murdered while I hide in a pantry. Vittorio recovered first, his expression shifting from surprise to calculation to something cold and amused. The nurse, from the crash. I heard about you, heard Matteo had developed an unfortunate attachment. How touching. He took a step toward her, and immediately 2 of his men moved to flank her, cutting off any escape. Give me the phone, sweetheart. Be smart. You don't want to be involved in this. Too late. I'm already involved. And I'm not giving you anything except a choice. Walk away now and no one has to die today, or force this, and the recording gets released and you lose everything. Sophie held the phone tighter, wishing her voice didn't shake, wishing she felt as brave as she was trying to sound. Your move. Vittorio studied her for a long moment, his dark eyes sharp and assessing. Then he smiled, slow and predatory. You know what? You're right. Killing Matteo here, now, was always going to be messy. Too many variables. Too many ways for it to go wrong. But this? He gestured to Sophie with casual malice. This changes things. This gives me leverage I didn't have before. Understanding hit Sophie a split second before Vittorio's men grabbed her. She tried to run, tried to fight, but they were professional kidnappers dealing with an amateur, and within seconds they had her arms pinned behind her back. Her phone torn from her grip and smashed against the floor. She screamed, kicked, fought with everything she had, but it was like fighting ocean currents, futile and exhausting and ultimately pointless. Let her go. Matteo's voice cracked with desperation, his gun now raised and pointed directly at Vittorio's head. This is between us. She's got nothing to do with our war. You want me dead? Fine. Let her walk out that door and I'll put the gun down. I'll make this easy for you. Just let her go. See? That's exactly the kind of sentimentality that makes you weak. Vittorio's smile widened as he watched Matteo's face, watched the agony there, fed on it like a vampire feeds on blood. You actually care about this girl. You, the man who's ordered hundreds of killings without blinking, are willing to die to protect some nurse you've known for what? A week? That's pathetic, Matteo. That's why you were never going to last as boss. You're too human, too soft. Vittorio, please. And there it was. The thing Sophie had never thought she'd hear from Matteo Ricci. Begging. Pleading with the man who'd betrayed him, willing to surrender everything just to keep her safe. I'll give you whatever you want. Money, connections, proof against the other families, anything. Name your price. Just don't hurt her. My price is simple. Vittorio pulled out his own gun, a sleek black thing that caught the morning light, and pointed it casually at Sophie's head. You get in your car and drive away. Leave Chicago. Leave Illinois. Disappear completely. Give up any claim to the family, any right to retaliate, any plans for revenge. Just vanish. Do that, and I let her live. And if I don't? Vittorio cocked the gun, the sound obscenely loud in the sudden silence. Then I blow her brains out right now while you watch. Then I kill you. And then I spend the next month hunting down everyone she ever cared about and making sure they die badly. Her mother, her friends, that nurse she works with, Maria, isn't it? I've done my research. I know everyone who matters to her. And I'll end them all as punishment for your defiance. Sophie watched Matteo's face as the words hit him, watched him realize that Vittorio had planned for this exact scenario, that he'd researched her life and her loved ones specifically to use as leverage against the man he wanted to destroy. Watched Matteo understand that no matter what he chose, he'd already lost. Don't. Sophie forced the word out past the terror choking her throat, past the gun barrel pressed against her skull, past every instinct screaming at her to shut up and let the men negotiate her survival. Don't you dare give up everything because of me. Don't let him win. Matteo, please, whatever happens to me, don't let it be for nothing. Sophie. Just her name, said like a prayer and a goodbye and an apology all wrapped together. Matteo's gun hand was trembling now, his gray-blue eyes bright with tears he refused to let fall. I can't lose you. Not like this. Not when I just found you. You're not losing me. You're choosing to save dozens of innocent people from being murdered because a sadistic bastard wants to use them as pawns. Sophie tried to smile even though tears were streaming down her face now, even though she was more terrified than she'd ever been in her life. You're choosing not to give in to terrorism. You're choosing to be the hero I always knew you could be. I'm not a hero. I'm a killer trying to save the only good thing that's happened to me in years. Then save me by not becoming a coward, by standing up to him, by not letting innocent people die because you think my life is worth more than theirs. Sophie locked eyes with Matteo across the room, willing him to hear her, to understand. This is your redemption, Matteo. Right here, right now. Choosing to do the hard thing instead of the easy thing. Choosing to protect many instead of sacrificing them for one. That's what heroes do. That's what my father would have done. Matteo's face crumpled, and for a moment Sophie saw past every wall and defense to the terrified boy underneath. The child who'd been broken by his father and shaped by violence and never taught that love could look like anything except pain. He was making a choice that would haunt him forever. She could see it happening, could see him deciding to let her go so that her family, her friends, everyone she cared about would survive this day. It was the most heartbreaking thing she'd ever witnessed, also the bravest. I'll go, Matteo said finally, his voice hollow and defeated. "I'll disappear. I'll give you everything. Just keep your word, Vittorio. Let her live. Let them all live. That's all I'm asking." "Done." Vittorio lowered his gun from Sophie's head and waved his men to release her. She stumbled forward, her legs barely supporting her weight, and Matteo caught her before she fell. For one precious moment they held each other. Sophie's face pressed against his chest, his arms wrapped around her like he could protect her from everything by sheer force of will. "I'm sorry," Matteo whispered into her hair. "I'm so sorry, for all of it, for dragging you into this, for falling for you when I had no right to, for not being strong enough to save you. You did save me. You're saving me right now by choosing not to start a bloodbath that would kill dozens of innocent people. That's salvation, Matteo. That's what it looks like." Sophie pulled back just enough to see his face, to memorize it, knowing this might be the last time she ever saw him. "Don't forget what we talked about redemption being a choice, about becoming someone different. Promise me you'll at least try." "I promise." He kissed her forehead, gentle and reverent, a blessing from a man who'd never believed in anything holy until her. "I'll try. For you. Because you believed I could be better." Touching. Truly. Vittorio's voice cut through the moment like a blade. "But we're done here. Matteo, start driving. North toward Canada. I'll have people watching to make sure you actually leave. And sweetheart?" He looked at Sophie with eyes that held no mercy, no humanity, just cold calculation. "You forget everything you saw here, everything you heard. You go back to your life and you stay quiet. Because if I hear even a whisper that you talk to cops or reporters or anyone, the deal's off. And everyone you love dies. Understand?" Sophie nodded, not trusting her voice, and let Matteo release her, even though it felt like tearing her own heart out. She watched him walk to the door, watched him stop and look back one last time, watched him mouth, "I love you," before disappearing into the morning sunlight. Then he was gone, and Sophie was alone with her would-be killers, and everything hurt in ways that had nothing to do with physical wounds. Vittorio kept his word. His men drove Sophie back to Chicago and dropped her at her apartment building like they were Uber drivers instead of mobsters who'd just witnessed a kidnapping and coup. They didn't speak to her during the 3-hour drive, didn't threaten her, didn't need to. The message was clear: stay silent or die, along with everyone you care about. Sophie stumbled into her apartment, locked every lock, and collapsed on her couch. She didn't cry. Couldn't cry. The emotions were too big, too overwhelming, too much to process. Instead, she just sat there in the gathering darkness, her phone showing 17 missed calls from Maria and her mother in the hospital, and wondered how her life had become this impossible mess. Wondered where Matteo was driving to, what he was thinking, if he was as shattered as she felt. Wondered if Vittorio would actually keep his word, or if everyone she loved was already being marked for death regardless of her silence. Wondered if she'd ever feel safe again, ever feel whole again, ever feel anything except this terrible, hollow grief that filled every corner of her chest. The answer would come 3 days later, in the form of breaking news that would change everything again. But for now, Sophie sat in her dark apartment and mourned for the man she'd saved twice, only to lose him anyway, to a world that refused to let either of them be free. Sophie returned to work at Mercy General the next day, because the alternative was sitting in her apartment obsessing over things she couldn't change, and people she couldn't save. She told Maria and her supervisor that the family emergency had been resolved, accepted their concerned looks and gentle questions with vague reassurances, and threw herself into the chaos of the ER with desperate gratitude for the distraction. But even trauma cases and screaming patients and the relentless tide of human suffering couldn't fully occupy her mind. Between intubations and chest compressions and stitching wounds, she found herself thinking about Matteo, wondering where he'd gone, if he was safe, if he thought about her the way she couldn't stop thinking about him, if he'd meant it when he said he loved her, or if that had just been words spoken in the heat of a desperate moment. 3 days after she'd watched him walk out of that lake house, Sophie was grabbing coffee from the break room when Maria cornered her with a phone showing a news headline: Chicago Mafia lieutenant arrested, cooperating with federal authorities. "You seeing this?" Maria asked, her eyes wide with the kind of fascination people always had for true crime stories. Vittorio Mancini, underboss of the Ricci crime family, turned himself in yesterday. They're saying he's giving up everything: names, operations, evidence against dozens of high-level mobsters. Biggest break the FBI's had in organized crime in 20 years. It's wild. Sophie's coffee cup slipped from her fingers, shattering on the break room floor in an explosion of ceramic and dark liquid. She barely noticed. What? I know, right? Apparently there was some kind of internal war in the family. The boss, Matteo Ricci, disappeared a few days ago. People thought maybe he was dead or had fled the country. And then yesterday, Mancini walks into the FBI office downtown with a lawyer and about 6 thumb drives full of evidence and starts talking. Maria scrolled through the article, fascinated. They're saying he might be in witness protection, that he turned on everyone to save his own skin. God, can you imagine living that life? Sophie couldn't speak, couldn't process what she was hearing. Vittorio had turned himself in, had cooperated with federal authorities. That made no sense. He'd won. He'd gotten everything he wanted. Why would he throw it all away? Unless he hadn't gotten everything, unless something had happened after she left, unless someone had forced his hand, unless Matteo had found a way to win from an impossible position. Sophie muttered some excuse to Maria about needing to clean up the coffee and practically ran from the break room. She spent her entire lunch break in her car, parked in the hospital garage, frantically scrolling through every news article she could find about Vittorio's arrest. The details were sparse. He'd walked into federal custody voluntarily, had immediately requested witness protection, and was cooperating fully with authorities investigating organized crime in Chicago and 6 surrounding states. But buried in one article, in a single paragraph that most people probably skimmed past, was the detail that made Sophie's heart stop. Sources close to the investigation report that Mancini's decision to cooperate came after his own lieutenant was found murdered in what appears to be a professional hit. The victim, whose name is being withheld pending notification of family, was allegedly one of Mancini's most trusted associates, and may have been killed as a message from rival factions. One of Vittorio's most trusted associates, murdered as a message. Sophie knew with bone-deep certainty who had sent that message. Knew that Matteo hadn't driven north to Canada to disappear into obscurity. Knew that he'd circled back, found one of Vittorio's key people, and eliminated them with the kind of brutal efficiency that reminded everyone exactly who they were dealing with. Knew that he'd forced Vittorio to choose between standing and fighting a war he'd now lose, or running to federal protection, and taking down the whole organization rather than let anyone else have it. Scorched earth tactics. If Matteo couldn't have the family, no one could. It was brilliant. Ruthless. Exactly the kind of move that proved why Matteo had been boss in the first place. And it meant that Sophie and everyone she loved were safe. Vittorio couldn't hurt them from witness protection. The threat was neutralized. The nightmare was over. Sophie put her head on the steering wheel and started to sob. Great heaving cries that came from somewhere deep in her chest. All the terror and grief and relief she'd been holding back for days finally breaking free. She cried for the man she'd lost, for the life they'd never get to build together, for the brief, shining possibility of redemption that had been snatched away by reality and circumstance, and a world that refused to let either of them be happy. She cried until she couldn't cry anymore, until her eyes were swollen and her throat raw, until her shift started again, and she had no choice but to pull herself together and go back to saving lives like her heart wasn't in pieces. That night, Sophie came home to find her apartment door unlocked. Fear spiked through her, immediate and primal, her hand already reaching for her phone to call 911. Then she saw the shadow standing by her window, backlit by the city lights, and her breath caught for entirely different reasons. Matteo. He looked like hell. Thinner than he'd been a week ago, dark circles under his eyes, his usual perfect hair disheveled, wearing jeans and a dark jacket instead of his typical expensive suits. But alive. Real. Standing in her apartment like a ghost made flesh. "You shouldn't be here," Sophie said, even as everything in her wanted to run to him, to touch him, to verify he was actually real and not some hallucination born of grief and exhaustion. "The FBI, Vittorio's people, everyone's looking for you." "I know. I can't stay long. Matteo's voice cracked. "I needed to see you. Needed to make sure you were okay. Needed to explain. You forced Vittorio into witness protection by killing one of his key people. You destroyed the organization rather than let him have it. You saved me and my family by making sure he'd spend the rest of his life hiding from everyone he betrayed." Sophie moved closer, drawn to him despite every rational thought screaming this was dangerous. "What's there to explain?" "That I lied. When I walked out of that lake house, when I said I'd disappear, I was lying." Matteo's jaw clenched. "I let you think I was giving up, surrendering, because I needed Vittorio to think he'd won. Needed him to let his guard down. The moment his people dropped you off, I doubled back and started hunting. Found Marco Torelli, Vittorio's right hand, the man he'd trusted to help orchestrate the coup. Put 3 bullets in him and left him where Vittorio would hear about it fast. You used yourself as bait. You made Vittorio think you'd given up, then proved you were still the most dangerous person in Chicago." Sophie should have been horrified, should have been disgusted by how casually he talked about murder. Instead, all she felt was a fierce pride that he'd found a way to win against impossible odds. That was incredibly risky. It was the only play that protected you, the only way to make sure he couldn't hurt you or anyone you cared about. If he's in witness protection, he's done. Finished. He'll spend the next 20 years testifying against everyone he ever worked with, and the families will want him dead for it. He'll never be free again. That's worse than killing him. That's making him live in a prison of his own, making for the rest of his life. They stood there in Sophie's dim apartment, close enough to touch but not touching, the weight of everything unsaid hanging between them like smoke. Finally, Sophie asked the question that had been eating at her since he'd disappeared. "What happens now? With you?" "I leave Chicago, tonight. I've got new identification, new name, money stashed in accounts Vittorio didn't know about. I'll disappear somewhere warm, somewhere far from all this. Start over, if that's even possible." Matteo's eyes searched her face like he was trying to memorize every detail. "I came here to say goodbye properly. To thank you for believing I could be better than what I was born to be. To tell you that meeting you, knowing you, being seen by you as human instead of monster, that changed something fundamental in me. You saved my life twice, Sophie D'Amico. Once from fire, once from myself. And now you're leaving." Sophie felt the tears start again, hot and immediate, but didn't try to stop them. "You're walking away from the only life you've ever known because it's too dangerous to stay, because staying means war and blood and eventually death. Yes, simple, final, inevitable. I can't ask you to come with me. I won't do that to you. You have a life here, a career, family and friends who love you. I can't ask you to give all that up for a man who'll spend the rest of his life looking over his shoulder, waiting for the bullet that will eventually come. That's not fair to you. That's not love. That's selfishness." Sophie laughed, the sound broken and watery. "You're really bad at understanding what I want. You know that? What I need, what I'm willing to sacrifice." She crossed the remaining distance between them and put her hands on his face, forcing him to look at her, to see her, to understand. I don't care about the danger. I don't care about leaving Chicago or my job or any of it. What I care about is you. The man who spent his entire life being told he was nothing but a killer, but who risked everything to protect me and the people I love. The man who's never had anyone believe in him, but who believed in me enough to walk away when he thought it would save me. Sophie, I love you. The words came out fierce and certain, leaving no room for argument or doubt. I love you, Matteo Ricci, whatever your new name is going to be. I love the broken boy you were, and the complicated man you became, and the person you're trying to become. And if you think I'm letting you disappear into the world alone after everything we've been through, you're out of your damn mind. Matteo stared at her like she'd just performed a miracle, like she'd reached down into hell and pulled him up into light he'd never thought he'd see. You can't mean that. You don't know what you'd be giving up, what life with me would look like. It's not safe. It's not stable. It's not the future you deserve. The future I deserve is the one I choose, and I choose you. I choose this. Whatever comes next, we face it together. Sophie kissed him then, fierce and desperate and claiming, pouring everything she felt into that contact. So the question isn't whether I'm coming with you. The question is, where are we going? Matteo kissed her back with the fervor of a man who'd been lost in darkness for years and had finally found his way home. When they broke apart, both breathing hard, his gray-blue eyes were bright with tears and hope, and something that looked like joy. Somewhere quiet. Somewhere by the ocean, maybe. Somewhere we can be nobody. Just two people building a life from scratch. That sounds perfect. Sophie smiled through her tears. When do we leave? 2 hours. I've got a car waiting. We drive tonight, ditch the car tomorrow, buy something with cash, keep moving until we're far enough away that Chicago is just a memory. Matteo touched her face gently, reverently, like she was something precious that might break. Are you sure? Really, truly sure? Because once we do this, there's no coming back. Your family will think you ran away. Your friends will think you abandoned them. You'll be giving up everything familiar for a life of uncertainty with a man whose past will always be hunting him. I need you to understand what you're choosing. I'm choosing love. I'm choosing life. I'm choosing to believe that redemption is possible, even for people who think they're beyond saving. Sophie put her hand over his, holding it against her cheek. I'm choosing you, Matteo. Every day. For as long as you'll have me. That's my choice, and I'm not changing my mind. They spent the next 2 hours in a flurry of activity. Sophie wrote letters to her mother, to Maria, to her supervisor at the hospital, trying to explain without really explaining. Said she'd met someone, that it was sudden but real, that she needed to follow where this led even if it meant leaving everything behind. She promised to stay in touch somehow, someday, when it was safe. She hoped they'd understand, hoped they'd forgive her, hoped they'd know she loved them even though she was choosing to leave. She packed one bag with essentials, clothes, medications, her father's firefighter badge, photos of the people and places she loved. Everything else got left behind. Her apartment would be abandoned, her rent eventually unpaid, her possessions boxed up or thrown away by a landlord who wouldn't understand why she'd disappeared. But none of that mattered compared to the man waiting by the door, watching her with expressions that cycled between gratitude and disbelief and desperate hope. At midnight, they walked out of Sophie's apartment for the last time. She looked back once, memorizing the space where she'd built a life, where she'd been safe and known and part of a community. Then she closed the door and took Matteo's hand, and they walked down the stairs together into a future neither of them could predict. The car was nondescript, a 10-year-old Honda sedan with Illinois plates that would be replaced before morning. Matteo drove, heading south out of Chicago, while Sophie watched the city lights fade in the rearview mirror. Her home, her history, everything familiar disappearing into darkness as they drove toward an uncertain tomorrow. "No regrets?" Matteo asked softly as they hit the highway, merging into sparse late-night traffic. Sophie looked at him, at this man who'd been shaped by violence but was choosing to walk away from it, who'd been taught that love meant pain but was brave enough to try something different, who'd spent his whole life being told he was worthless but had given her everything when it mattered most. She thought about the choice she was making, the life she was leaving behind, the unknown stretching ahead of them like a dark road with no map. "No regrets," Sophie said firmly, and meant it with every fiber of her being. "This is where I'm supposed to be. With you. Whatever comes next, we'll figure it out together." Matteo reached over and took her hand, threading their fingers together, and drove on through the night toward a future they'd build from nothing. Toward redemption, toward second chances, toward the possibility that two broken people could save each other and become something whole. Behind them, Chicago burned with the chaos of Vittorio's testimony. Dozens of arrests, families crumbling as their secrets spilled into public record. The empire Matteo had inherited and then destroyed rather than let it corrupt anyone else. Let it all burn. Let the world they'd known turn to ash. They didn't need it anymore. All they needed was each other. And the chance to prove that love could be louder than violence, that choosing compassion over cruelty wasn't weakness, but the bravest thing either of them would ever do. That redemption wasn't something granted by others, but something you built for yourself, one good choice at a time. They drove south through the night, two ghosts fleeing toward rebirth, and neither looked back. 6 months later, the house was small, a 2-bedroom cottage painted pale yellow with white shutters, nestled on a quiet street in a coastal town in North Carolina where nobody knew their names or cared about their pasts. Tourists came through in summer to enjoy the beaches, locals ran the restaurants and shops, and Michael and Sophie Sullivan were just another young couple trying to make a life together. Michael Sullivan. That's what Matteo's new identification said, the papers clean and professional enough to pass any background check that didn't dig too deep. Sophie had kept her first name but taken his new last name when they'd had a justice of the peace marry them in a small ceremony 2 months ago. No guests, no family. Just them and a witness they'd paid $20, and the promise that this was real, that this was forever, that they'd build something beautiful from the ashes of who they used to be. Matteo, Michael, worked at a local construction company, doing honest labor for the first time in his life, framing houses, pouring concrete, learning to use his hands for creation instead of destruction. He came home every night covered in sawdust and sweat, his muscles aching from physical work that was somehow more satisfying than anything he'd done running a criminal empire. The men he worked with thought he was a veteran trying to readjust to civilian life, which wasn't entirely untrue. They respected his privacy, included him in their weekend barbecues, taught him about power tools and building codes and the simple pleasure of making something with your own hands. Sophie had gotten a job at the local hospital, working in the emergency department again because that's what she knew, what she was good at, what made her feel useful. The pace was slower than Chicago, more heart attacks and car accidents than gunshot wounds and stabbings. But the work was meaningful. She saved lives. She comforted the dying. She did what she'd always done, just in a place where violence was the exception instead of the rule. They lived carefully, never talking about Chicago, never mentioning the past, never giving anyone reason to wonder why they'd moved here or where they'd come from. They were boring, forgettable, exactly what they needed to be. And slowly, day by day, they started to believe in the life they were building. Started to believe they might actually get away with this impossible second chance. The nightmares still came sometimes. Matteo would wake gasping, his hands instinctively reaching for weapons that weren't there, his mind trapped in memories of violence and blood. Sophie would hold him until the shaking stopped, would remind him where he was, who he'd become, that the past didn't own him anymore, that he was safe, that they both were safe. And sometimes Sophie woke in terror, dreaming of Vittorio finding them, of men with guns breaking down their door, of everything they'd built being destroyed in moments. Matteo would be there, solid and real, whispering promises that he'd never let anyone hurt her, that he'd die before he let the violence of his old life touch her again, that she'd saved him, and now he'd spend the rest of his life proving she was right to believe in him. On a Saturday morning in late spring, they sat on their small back porch drinking coffee and watching the sun rise over the Atlantic. The sky turned pink and gold and orange, reflecting off the water, painting everything in colors that seemed too beautiful to be real. Matteo had his arm around Sophie's shoulders, and she leaned into him, feeling perfectly content in a way she'd never expected to feel again after leaving Chicago. "I've been thinking about something," Matteo said quietly, his voice still rough with sleep. "Something I need to tell you before this goes any further." Sophie's heart clenched, fear spiking through her content. This is where he says he's bored, where he says the quiet life isn't enough, where he decides he misses the power and the money and the respect that came with being a boss. "Okay. I want to turn myself in." The words came out quick, like he'd been holding them back for weeks, and they'd finally escaped, despite his best efforts. "To the FBI. I want to cooperate like Vittorio did. I want to testify against the families, give them everything I know, help them take down the entire operation. I want to do the right thing, Sophie. Finally. Actually, the way you always believed I could." Sophie pulled back to look at him, searching his face for signs of doubt or fear or regret. But all she saw was determination and something that looked like hope. "You know what that means, right? Witness protection, new identities again, constant supervision, possible prison time depending on what deal they offer you. We'd lose this life we've built. We'd have to start over somewhere else, maybe multiple times. It's not easy. It's not safe. It's choosing to put ourselves back in danger after we finally got free. I know. But every day I wake up and I know that somewhere the families are still operating, still hurting people, still recruiting kids like I was recruited, breaking them the way I was broken, turning them into monsters who think violence is the only language that matters. And I know that I could stop some of that. Maybe not all of it. Maybe not even most of it. But some." Matteo's jaw tightened, and Sophie saw the boy he'd been underneath the man he'd become. "My father used to say that Ricci's don't quit, that we see things through no matter the cost. For once in my life, I want to use that stubbornness for something good. I want to be the reason the families fall. I want to save the next kid who would have been me if nobody intervened." Sophie felt tears prickling her eyes, but these weren't tears of sadness or fear. These were tears of pride, of love, of witnessing the exact moment when redemption stopped being a concept and became a choice, an action, a commitment to being better than everything that had shaped him. "Okay," she said simply. Matteo blinked. "Okay? Just like that? You're not going to try to talk me out of it? Point out all the ways this could go wrong? Tell me I'm insane for voluntarily walking back into that world? You're definitely insane. But you're also right." Sophie took his face in her hands, making sure he heard her, understood her. "This is your redemption, Matteo. This is you choosing to be the hero instead of the villain. This is you using everything terrible you experienced and learned to prevent other people from being destroyed the same way. How could I possibly try to talk you out of that? Because it's dangerous. Because we could lose everything. Because I love you," Sophie interrupted. "I believe in what you're trying to do. I believe you can save people. I believe you should save people. And whatever happens next, whatever we have to give up or go through or survive, we do it together. That's what I signed up for when I married you. That's what I meant when I said for better or worse. This is the worst part. And I'm still here, still choosing you, still believing we can make something good come from all the bad. Mateo pulled her into his arms and held her like she was the only thing keeping him anchored to earth, his face buried in her hair, his breathing unsteady. I don't deserve you. I don't deserve any of this. But God, I'm grateful. So grateful you pulled me out of that burning car. So grateful you saw something in me worth saving. So grateful you're stubborn enough to believe in redemption even for someone like me. You saved me too, Sophie reminded him gently. You protected me when you didn't have to. You gave up everything to keep me and my family safe. You walked away from power because I asked you to. We saved each other, Mateo. That's what this is. That's what we do. They contacted the FBI the next week through a lawyer in Charlotte who specialized in witness protection cases. The initial meeting was tense. Federal agents skeptical that the former head of the Ricci crime family was genuinely offering cooperation, not setting a trap. But Mateo came with evidence. Thumb drives full of financial records, video recordings of meetings, documentation of every criminal operation he'd ever been involved in. He held nothing back, gave them everything they needed to dismantle not just his family, but half a dozen others that had been operating in the Midwest. The deal took months to negotiate. Mateo would plead guilty to reduced charges: racketeering, money laundering, conspiracy. In exchange for his full cooperation and testimony, he'd get 15 years in federal prison, eligible for parole after 7. Sophie could stay with him through the process, would be relocated under witness protection after his testimony was complete, would be given a new identity and enough money to start over somewhere far from anywhere the families operated. It wasn't perfect, but it was justice. Real justice. The kind that acknowledged the harm done while still believing in the possibility of redemption and rehabilitation. The trials were brutal. Mateo spent 3 months testifying against men he'd known his entire life, detailing crimes that made the prosecutors pale and the jury members cry. He answered every question honestly, never minimizing his own involvement, never trying to paint himself as less culpable than he was. He owned every terrible thing he'd done, every person he'd hurt, every life he'd ruined or ended. And then he explained how the system worked, how boys were recruited and broken, how violence became normalized, how leaving was made impossible through threats and conditioning and the destruction of any identity outside the family. His testimony led to 43 convictions, 43 men who would spend decades in federal prison for crimes they'd committed over years of operation. Millions of dollars in illegal assets seized, operations shut down across 6 states. It was, the prosecutors said, the most significant blow to organized crime in the Midwest in 30 years. When the final trial concluded, Mateo was sentenced to his agreed-upon 15 years at a medium-security federal facility in Pennsylvania. Sophie was in the courtroom, watching as the man she loved was led away in handcuffs, and she didn't cry. Didn't let herself break. Just memorized his face as he looked back at her one last time before disappearing through the doors. 7 years. Maybe less with good behavior and continued cooperation. 7 years until she could touch him again. Kiss him again. Build a life with him in whatever new place witness protection chose for them. 7 years of letters and monitored phone calls and monthly visits where they'd talk through bulletproof glass. 7 years of waiting and hoping and believing that when he got out, they'd have the future they'd been promised. The one they'd fought so hard to earn. It was a long time. An eternity. But Sophie had pulled a stranger from a burning car once, and she'd do whatever it took to save him again and again until he was truly free. That's what love was. That's what redemption required. Not a single grand gesture, but thousands of small choices to not give up, to keep believing, to trust that the broken parts could be mended if you just refused to stop trying. 3 years into his sentence, Sophie visited Mateo at the federal facility like she did every month without fail. They sat across from each other in the visitation room, hands pressed to opposite sides of the glass barrier between them, and talked about their days. She told him about her new nursing job in Oregon, about the apartment witness protection had set her up in, about the ocean she could see from her bedroom window. He told her about the degree he was working on through the prison education program, about the counseling sessions he attended, about the book he was writing, about his experience with organized crime and rehabilitation. "I've been thinking about something," Mateo said, echoing the conversation they'd had years ago on that porch in North Carolina. "When I get out, assuming you're still willing to have me, I want to work with at-risk youth. Kids like I was, ones being recruited by gangs and families, ones who think violence is their only option. I want to show them there's another way, that you can walk away, that your past doesn't have to define your future." Sophie's throat tightened with emotion. "You'd be amazing at that. Those kids would be lucky to have someone who actually understands what they're going through, who's lived it and survived it and became something different. I never would have thought I could be that person. Never would have believed redemption was possible. But you showed me. You pulled me out of the fire, Sophie. Literally the first time. Metaphorically every time after. You saved me when I didn't think I deserved saving, when I didn't even want to be saved. And now I get to spend the rest of my life trying to do the same for others. That's not just redemption. That's grace." 4 years later, Mateo was released on parole. He'd served 7 years of his 15-year sentence, had been a model prisoner, had completed his degree in social work, had continued cooperating with federal authorities, investigating remaining organized crime operations. The parole board determined he was rehabilitated, reformed, no longer a threat to society. He walked out of federal prison into a cold November morning, and Sophie was waiting. She'd aged in the years they'd been apart, fine lines around her eyes that hadn't been there before, silver threading through her dark hair. But her smile was the same. Her eyes were the same. And when she wrapped her arms around him for the first time in 7 years, when he breathed in the scent of her and felt her heartbeat against his chest and realized this was real, he was free. They'd actually made it through the impossible. Mateo started to cry. They held each other in the parking lot, while other parolees were picked up by family members and lawyers and rehabilitation counselors, and neither cared that they were making a scene. 7 years of waiting, 7 years of believing, 7 years of refusing to give up on each other, or the possibility that love could survive anything if you just held on tight enough. "Welcome home," Sophie whispered into his shoulder. And Mateo realized that home wasn't a place. It was this woman who'd risked everything to save him, who'd believed in redemption when he couldn't believe in anything, who'd waited and hoped and loved him through the worst parts of himself, until he finally became someone worthy of that love. They moved to a small town in Montana, as far from Chicago, and organized crime in the past as they could get. Mateo got a job at a youth center, working with troubled teenagers, teaching them that violence wasn't strength and vulnerability wasn't weakness. Sophie worked at the local hospital, saving lives the way she always had, making a difference one patient at a time. They bought a house on the edge of town, nothing fancy, just a 3-bedroom ranch with a yard and a view of mountains that seemed impossible in their beauty. They adopted a dog from the local shelter, a huge mutt with shaggy fur who'd been abandoned and needed someone to believe in him. They learned to garden, to hike, to sit on their porch in the evenings and watch the stars appear one by one over the landscape. They built a life. Not the life either of them had imagined when Sophie pulled a burning stranger from a wrecked car on a Chicago street 7 years ago. Not the life Mateo had been raised to expect, with power and money and fear serving as currency. Not the life Sophie had planned, with a career in the city and family nearby and the comfort of the familiar, but a good life, an honest life, a life built on the foundation of second chances and stubborn faith, and the radical belief that people could change if given the opportunity and support and someone willing to see them as human instead of irredeemable. 10 years after the fire, they sat on their porch watching the sunset paint the mountains gold and rose. Mateo's hair had more silver now, and he wore reading glasses when he worked on case files for the kids he counseled. Sophie had laugh lines etched deep around her eyes and mouth, marks of a decade spent finding joy in small things instead of being consumed by trauma. They'd both added scars to their collections, emotional ones from the hard work of healing, physical ones from living fully instead of carefully. "Do you ever regret it?" Mateo asked suddenly, breaking the comfortable silence. "Stopping for that burning car? Everything that came after? The years I was in prison? The life you gave up?" Sophie considered the question seriously, looking back over the decade they'd survived together. The terror and the separation and the constant vigilance, but also the love and the growth and the proof that redemption wasn't just a concept, but an actual, achievable reality. "Not once," she said firmly. "Not for a single second. You want to know why?" "Why?" "Because that night, pulling you from that fire, that was the moment my life stopped being about just surviving and started being about living. Really living. Not just going through the motions, but actually connecting with someone, mattering to someone, being part of something bigger than myself." Sophie took his hand, threading their fingers together the way she had 1,000 times before. "You think I saved you? You saved me right back. From a life that was safe but empty. From never taking risks. From never believing in anything except the immediate and the practical. I turned your entire world upside down," Mateo pointed out. "You did. And I wouldn't change a single thing about it. Not the fear or the danger or the years of waiting. Not any of it. Because it led here. To this. To us. To proof that people are more than the worst things they've done. That love is stronger than violence. That choosing compassion over cruelty, hope over cynicism, faith over fear, that those choices matter. They change things. They save things." Sophie squeezed his hand. "They saved you. They saved me. And now you're out there saving other people, showing them the same possibility we showed each other. That's not regret. That's the opposite of regret. That's purpose." Mateo pulled her closer, kissing her temple, his free hand rubbing small circles on her shoulder. "I spent the first 33 years of my life thinking I was damned, broken beyond repair, destined to become a monster, and die a monster. Then you pulled me from that fire and looked at me like I was worth saving. Like I could be more than what I'd been shaped to be. And slowly, impossibly, I started to believe it. Started to become it. You gave me back my humanity, Sophie. You gave me a soul. That's not something I can ever adequately thank you for. You thank me every day. Every time you choose to be gentle instead of violent. Every time you help a kid see another path. Every time you wake up next to me and choose us over the easier path of running or shutting down, or going back to what you knew." Sophie turned in his arms to face him fully, seeing the man he'd become instead of the man he'd been. "Redemption isn't a destination, Mateo. It's a journey. And you're walking it every single day. That's enough. That's everything." They sat together as the sun disappeared below the mountains, as darkness rolled across the valley like a blanket, as the first stars began to appear overhead. Two people who'd been shaped by fire and blood and impossible choices. Two people who'd somehow found each other in the chaos. Two people who'd decided that love was worth fighting for, that change was possible, that second chances were real if you were brave enough to reach for them. The past was behind them, its lessons learned, but its grip finally loosened. The future stretched ahead, uncertain as all futures are, but faced together instead of alone. And the present, this moment, sitting on their porch in a town where nobody knew their history, or cared about their scars, where they were just Michael and Sophie Sullivan who'd found each other and held on through everything. This was perfect. Not the perfection of easy or simple or without challenges, but the perfection of earned and fought for and worth every sacrifice. The perfection of two broken things mended together, stronger at the seams than they'd ever been apart. The perfection of redemption realized, of faith rewarded, of stubborn love winning against all odds. Sophie D'Amico had pulled a stranger from a burning car 7 years ago, not knowing he was the Mafia boss himself, not knowing it would change both their lives forever, not knowing that saving him would mean being saved herself. She'd do it again in a heartbeat. Some people were born to run toward the flames while everyone else ran away. Born to see possibility where others saw only ruin. Born to believe in redemption, even when the world said it was impossible. Sophie was one of those people. So was Matteo, though it had taken him longer to realize it. And together, they'd proven that the bravest thing you could do wasn't surviving the fire. It was pulling someone else from the flames, and then walking beside them through the darkness afterward, refusing to let go, refusing to give up, refusing to accept that anyone was beyond saving. That was love. That was courage. That was redemption. And it was enough. God, it was enough.